The scientific method. The scientific method has 6 steps involved in it. As you can see, these 6 steps include, number 1 is a problem. Obviously, there has to be a problem if you want to do some kind of scientific investigation to figure out what's causing that problem. Number 2, you do a little bit of research so you can come up with an educated guess, which brings us to number 3, which is form a formal hypothesis. And then number 4, you have to test or do an experiment to test your hypothesis. Number 5, you collect your data and you analyze that data. And then finally, number 6, you draw a conclusion from your data, stating whether or not your hypothesis was supported or your hypothesis was proven to be true or false. So what I want to do first, before we get into the real scientific terminology of this, let's kind of give just a general, everyday, possibly everyday scenario that you might be able to understand a little bit better. So a general example, we're going to use football. So step 1 in the scientific method is the problem. So our problem in this example is the team isn't winning games. So step 2 is research. So since the team isn't winning games, coach is going to do a little bit of research during practice to see possibly what the problem is. So coach observes his team during practice and thinks the problem could be the quarterback. So now that he's got a little bit of information, he can potentially come up with an educated guess. So step 3 is our hypothesis. Coach makes an educated guess, which would be in the form of, if we change the quarterback, then we will gain more yards per game, therefore possibly winning more. Step 4, coach has to set up an experiment to test his hypothesis. So coach tests his guess to see if he is correct. During practices, quarterback A plays for 1 hour and the number of yards are recorded. The next hour, quarterback B plays and the number of yards are recorded. This is done for 5 practices. So it's always better to do multiple trials, hence he does 5 practices instead of 1. So moving on, so step 5 is where coach is going to take down his data. So this is the analyze data, collecting the data and then seeing what it's telling you. So I've got a table on your screen, and it's a very simple table, but it's a table. Data tables are necessary for scientific methods. So you can see I've titled the table comparing the number of yards gained during practice with 2 different quarterbacks. So in my table I've got day 1 all the way to day 5, and then I've got quarterback A, quarterback B, and the number of yards they gained for each one of those practices. And then down there at the bottom I've got average yards for each quarterback A and quarterback B. Along with the data table, once you fill in your data table, the easiest way to analyze this, in other words, to see what the data is saying, is to build a graph from your data table, which I have on the next slide. So if you look at this graph, again, very simple graph. I've got the title of the graph up here, which is necessary for graphs. You have to have a title. So average yards gained, quarterback A, quarterback B down here on the x-axis, and then I've got the yards on the y-axis. One thing that's missing from this graph that should be on here is this y-axis needs a label. So I guess I couldn't figure out how to do it in my Excel, but on this side right here it should say yards gained, and that would tell me what these numbers mean. So you can see quarterback A was only a little bit above 60 yards gained, whereas quarterback B was slightly above 80 yards gained on average. So this right here automatically tells me that quarterback B is probably better at the job of being quarterback than quarterback A. So the next step is step 6, which is conclusion. So based on that data, after we analyzed it, coach's educated guess was correct. Quarterback A only averaged 60.8 yards at practice, while quarterback B averaged 80.4 yards per game or at practice. So with this knowledge, coach would probably then try out quarterback B in the next few games and see if that would solve his problem of not winning games. So that was a general example of how the scientific method can be used in other situations than just a typical science in a laboratory that a lot of students can't understand. So hopefully that kind of simplifies it a bit. Now let's move on to a more scientific example. So step 1, problem. What would you like to learn more about after you have observed something? So we're going to use an example that I read from an article. I'm not going to read the article to you, but it's basically a real article back in early 2000 about how a bunch of seals were dying on the East Coast. So obviously that's the problem. Okay, so example, everything in red from here on out is going to be from this example, from that article. So the example for step 1, why are hooded seals dying? So that's obviously a problem. So that's our step 1. Step 2, you must do some research to come up with an educated guess. So the research that was done, and this, I kind of made this part up, but the research that was done was after doing necropsies, which are autopsies on animals. So after doing necropsies on the dead hooded seals, scientists noticed that most of the dead seals' stomachs contained a lot of a fish species, and we'll call that fish species A, that is not part of their normal diet. So basically after doing necropsies on these hooded seals, they realized the ones that were dead, that they were doing the necropsies on, had a particular fish species in their stomach that wasn't really known to be part of their hooded seal's normal diet. So with this knowledge, the scientists were able to come up with a hypothesis, an educated guess. So these educated guesses, these hypotheses, must be stated in a particular format. It has to be in the if-then format, which you see in purple right here. The if-then format. The if, what comes after the if, is what you will change, which we call the independent variable. And what comes after the then is what you predict will happen because of that change, and that's the dependent variable. So let's look at the example. If the hooded seal's diet consisted mainly of fish species A, then the mortality rate would increase. So basically what I'm guessing, because of my research, I'm guessing that if we fed a group of seals this fish species A, which is not part of what we know to be their normal diet, if we fed them fish species A, then more of them would die, the mortality rate. So the mortality rate would increase. So the independent variable is what I'm changing. So I'm changing the hooded seal's diet to mainly fish species A. That's what I'm testing. And so that's the independent variable. So the diet with more fish species A. The dependent variable is the prediction. It's always what comes after the then. Okay, because what you predict is going to happen is going to come after the then. And the mortality rate would increase. That is my prediction of what's going to happen. And that prediction is completely dependent on what I change. So this mortality rate will increase is dependent on this diet being changed. So that's why we call it the dependent variable. Okay, so moving on. So now we have to set up a test or experiment. So step 4, test or experiment, a step-by-step procedure on how you will test your hypothesis. You must include 2 groups in your test and experiment. So the 2 groups will consist of a control group and an experimental group. Now the control group is set up so you have something to compare your data from your experimental group to. If you don't have a control group, then you'll get numbers, data for your experimental group, but they won't really mean anything because you don't have anything to compare it to. So you'll probably understand here in just a minute. So here's my step-by-step procedure on how I would set up this test and experiment. So step 1, feed one group of 30 hooded seals their normal diet for 6 months. This is going to be my control group. It's going to be 30 hooded seals that get their normal diet and in certain situations, certain conditions. Step 2, feed one group of 30 hooded seals a diet that consists of mainly fish species A for 6 months. This is my experimental group because they are receiving what we are experimenting, that fish species A. So this is my test group, you can say. So I'm going to compare this data that I get from this group to this data in my control group to see if there's a big difference. Step 3, both groups of hooded seals are between the ages of 5 to 15. Both groups receive the same amount of food at the same time, so both groups are cared for the same way. Now you have to put this type of information in here to show that your control group and your experimental group are exactly the same except for what's being tested. And in this case, it's the diet, the fish species A. So that way we can eliminate anything else that might be killing these hooded seals. So we don't want one group to be 30 years or older and one group be 5 years or younger, because then age could have a role in the death. So we want to keep everything about the 2 groups exactly the same except for what we're testing, which is feeding them fish species A. So step 4, observe the health of the 2 groups of hooded seals every week for 6 months. So this tells me how often I'm going to view or observe, take data in this experiment. So I'm going to observe the health of the 2 groups of hooded seals every week. So let's say every Sunday I go in their enclosures and I count the number of sick hooded seals or possibly deceased hooded seals. And then step 5, after 6 months, determine the number of seals in both groups that became ill or died. All right, so that's my step-by-step test experiment. And this tests my hypothesis. So next we have, hold on one second. Okay. So next we have with our data analysis, you'll see my data table. As mentioned, you always have to have a data table. And you'll see my months. I actually did for 12 months here, whereas my test experiment said 6 months, so that should have been changed, but it's still giving you what you need to see. So the controlled group, the normal diet, experimental group, fish species A diet. You can see the number of hooded seals that had passed each month, and then I totaled those deaths down here, and then I got a percent. So only 10% of the hooded seals on the control group, in the control group, or that were getting fed the normal diet, passed, whereas 50% passed in the experimental group. And then I've got a data table, very simple. There's my title, here's my x-axis, and then my y-axis again. There should be a label right there with number of deceased hooded seals, or percent of deceased hooded seals. Now I draw my conclusion, state whether or not your hypothesis was supported by your data. Also include how your data did or did not support your hypothesis. So here's my example. My results supported my hypothesis. Only 3 of 30, or 10% of the hooded seals on the regular diet died, but 15 of 30, or 50% of the hooded seals on the fish species A diet died. So this is my step 6 conclusion. It must be about 2 sentences. The first one stating whether or not your hypothesis was supported, and the next one bringing some data into that to support your first sentence. So I hope this helps with the scientific method. Please go back over or review this lesson to help you if you do not fully understand.